Welcome to the show. In this episode, we are going to go there. We're going to talk about Islam and Islamophobia. And we know there's more than one kind of Islam. Is there more than one kind of Islamophobia? Trigger alert, if you're sensitive to uncomfortable truths, this might not be the episode for you. But if you aren't allergic to talking about things that are true and difficult to grasp and to see things as they really are, I think you're going to get a ton out of this episode of The Patrick Coffin Show. Confessions of an Islamophobe, with the author coming up straight ahead. Yes, indeed. So glad you're here. Our guest is Robert Spencer, director of Jihad Watch and the author of 17 books and growing about Islam and the West. Mr. Spencer has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, the U.S. intelligence community, and other groups. He's been interviewed or has debated on dozens of the world's top media outlets, and I'm honored to speak with him about his latest book, Confessions of an Islamophobe. Robert Spencer, hello, sir.
Hey, hello, Patrick. How are you?
I'm great. I just finished. I'm in the final quarter of finishing to the finish line your book, and it's, first of all, it's accidentally funny in parts. You've got a real Gobi Desert Dry sense of humor about such a dark topic. But I want to start maybe at the beginning, and maybe people who know about your work but don't know your family background, this Turkish-Greek extraction. And what really jumped off the page in the opening chapter, Robert, was the sentence of I believe your grandfather, "We were exiled," and you kind of sort of being the hook of your interest in Islam from an early age. I've interviewed Daria Little, who's from Turkey, and it's not an easy scenario to summarize the relationship between Islam and Turkish culture and society. Maybe we can start there with your family background.
Sure. My family is from the last great caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate period, unless you count ISIS. Mm-hmm. And the Ottoman Empire, in its death throes at the end of World War I, was beset by independence movements, notably of the Greek and Armenian Christians. And the Greeks had already won independence on the European mainland in 1821. But there was a very considerable population of Greek Christians in Western Asia Minor, the western part of what is now Turkey. And they've been there since time immemorial, if you go back to the Trojan War and so on. And so they wanted independence as well. And so did the Armenians. This, in the eyes of Islamic law, rendered them kufar harbi, infidels at war with Islam, who could lawfully be killed. And the Turks gave them the choice of exile first. And it was the stringent conditions, the inhuman conditions of the exile that led to the Armenian Genocide. As the Armenians were being forced out of eastern Turkey, there were 1.5 million who were murdered along the way. Mm-hmm. And the Greeks, it was the same in the West to a lesser degree. My family was able to get out, with the exception of my great-grandfather, who was killed by a Turkish soldier as they were leaving. And they were exiled solely because they chose not to convert to Islam. And so this is what actually gave birth to my interest in this topic. Not their experience, but actually trying to discover what their experience was. Because you're recounting that my grandfather said we were exiled. That's about all he said about it. My grandmother was much more effusive and spoke about how beautiful the call to prayer was, like Barack Obama has said, and so on, and how much she loved living there, and told me all sorts of stories about life over there. Mm-hmm. But they were both very taciturn when it came to explaining why they were in New York City instead of in Turkey. Finally, I decided to find out on my own, and that led me into the study of Islam and jihad and the whole concept of the Islamic State, in which the non-Muslims have to live in a subjugated condition, denied basic rights. Forbidden to build new churches or repair old ones, forbidden to hold authority over Muslims, having to pay a special tax from which the Muslims are exempt, and so on.
So in Canada or in England, where you're banned, by the way, by Prime Minister Theresa May,
for Islamophobia.
Well, you can be a member of Parliament, you can stand for public office, you can become a congressman. In theory, you could become the President of the United States. What about Jews or Christians in Muslim lands? Are they allowed any kind of political office to be held?
No, if the Muslim land is adhering to Islamic law, which certainly not all Muslim lands do today, but it still remains the content of Islamic law, then no non-Muslim can hold authority over a Muslim. So no non-Muslim could hold political power.
When did you learn that the Southern Poverty Law Center deemed you one of the nation's most notorious Islamophobes? More and more of my guests are on that list. I don't know. I guess it's a matter of time before we're all on the list.
Indeed. If they get wind of this show, you'll be on the list. Mm-hmm. The Southern Poverty Law Center, I don't remember the first time I heard it. Certainly they've been gunning for anybody who's opposed to jihad terror for years. It's their contention that Islamophobia is a bigger problem than jihad terror, and that those of us who are calling attention to jihad terror are motivated by a desire for ill-gotten financial gain or out of hatred and bigotry or both. Mm-hmm. And so they have been calling me names for years, saying I'm a hate group leader and so on. This only has become more than a simple irritant over the last few months, because after the attack in Charlottesville, in which apparently a right-wing protester drove his car into some left-wing protesters and killed one, the left has been using that as its Reichstag fire moment, trying to use it to destroy any and all opposition. And they're using the Southern Poverty Law Center's entirely spurious and biased hate group list to try to destroy those groups and individuals completely. And so things have gotten interesting on that basis over the last few months.
What doesn't compute for me is Mrs. May's statement that Islamophobia comes from the same wellspring of hatred as anti-Semitism hatred. There's 2 and 2 is 5 here.
Yeah, absolutely. But 2 and 2 is 5 is the official policy of the British government. In fact, the idea that Islamophobia stems from the same wellspring as anti-Semitism ignores several key facts. One is Jews in Nazi Germany, and Jews before the Nazis took control of Germany, were not mounting any terror attacks at all. Nor were they justifying any terror attacks, nor were they interfering with law enforcement efforts or decrying them as racist and bigoted, nor were they boasting of an imminent takeover of Germany. They were entirely innocent victims of the anti-Semitism that was the linchpin of Hitler's program. And it was an entirely paranoid fabrication that was able to capture the imagination of enough Germans, and certainly to our shame, many German Christians fell for this because they had been conditioned to think that the Jews were complicit in the death of Christ and so on. And so that cannot be discounted as an element of it, but certainly the Nazis were a non-Christian movement, an anti-Christian movement that took Christian anti-Semitism and made it into something much more vicious and much more violent than it ever had been. Now, to conflate that, the victimizing on a wholesale basis of innocent people with concern for jihad terror and Sharia oppression is a moral myopia of astounding proportions. The Muslims in the United States, obviously, most of them have not committed terror attacks. But all the major Muslim organizations, while condemning terror attacks, they have not done a single thing. There's not a single program anywhere in the U.S. to teach young Muslims why they should reject the ISIS Al-Qaeda understanding of Islam. There is a significant support for Sharia blasphemy laws and other aspects of Sharia that are at variance with American laws among American Muslims. There is the constant ongoing drumbeat of terror attacks in the United States and jihad terror plots in the United States by Muslims, while Muslim communities and Muslim organizations are not taking any effective steps to make sure the next one doesn't happen. And so the idea, and also, nobody is calling for Muslims to be put into camps. Nobody is calling for them to be killed. Nobody's calling for them to be denied any rights whatsoever. They're only calling for existing laws to be enforced when it comes to Islamic jihad terrorism. And to conflate the two things is a vicious propaganda move on the part of Theresa May and on the part of those others who have made this equation and claimed that the Muslims in America or Europe are the new Jews. And it's designed just in the same way as the Islamophobia initiative is designed in general, to intimidate people and to make them fear to oppose jihad terror for fear that they will be smeared in this way. And smeared, as I was by Theresa May, people by the very highest levels of government.
It's a threefer, it seems to me. It's a blend of George Orwell and Brave New World and Saul Alinsky all wrapped up in one, where your enemies are ritually shamed, and the drumbeat starts, and no one pays attention to the actual texts of for instance, the phenomenon we're talking about, Islam. The different maybe we can make a distinction between the texts, the foundational documents, and what they command, versus how it works out in the real world.
Well, of course, Patrick, every individual is different. And there are nominal Christians and there are fervent Christians. And it's the same thing for Jews, for Hindus, for Buddhists. There are people who know the religion very well and practice it scrupulously and carefully. And there are people who don't know or care about what it teaches, but still would call themselves by the label of whatever religion they adhere to, or whatever their community adheres to. And so it's the same thing in the case of Islam. Islam teaches certain things. They're not really hard to find. They're not even hard to understand. They come from the Qur'an, which loudly proclaims that it itself is clear and easy to understand many times. They come from the teachings of Muhammad. They come from the rulings of Islamic law. These things are not difficult to find. And that being the case, there's not really any question about what Islam is all about. But that does not mean that any individual Muslim is putting into practice the teachings, any particular teaching of Islam, just as it's in the case of Christianity. Jesus says to love your enemies and turn the other cheek. But it's very easy to find Christians who don't do that. That doesn't mean that he didn't say it. That doesn't mean that it's not what a Christian should do. In the same way, Islam teaches jihad warfare against unbelievers. It's very easy to find Muslims who aren't waging it, but that doesn't mean it's not there to be waged and that Islamic jihadis are not exploiting those texts in order to make recruits among peaceful Muslims.
One of the things that I drew from the book was the consensus. Let's start with the UK and the findings of Mohammed Hisham Kabani in surveying 114 mosques. What kind of consensus did he find there?
Hisham Kabani is actually in the U.S.
Oh, he's in the U.S.? Others?
Yes, he is.
Okay.
And he went around went around the whole country in 1998, and as you say, he toured 114 mosques, and he looked at their teachings, looked at what kind of literature they had, and then in January 1999, he testified before a State Department open forum that 80% of mosques in the U.S. were teaching hatred of Jews and Christians, and the necessity ultimately to destroy the Constitution and constitutional rule and to impose Islamic law. Now, Hisham Kabani got a lot of heat from that from Muslim leaders, and ultimately he was, it appears, frightened into silence. His testimony was taken offline, and so on. But I was able to preserve a great deal of it in this book, and it's important to note that all the people who were criticizing him and even threatening him, they never said he was wrong. They never said that what he was saying was true. And there have been no countervailing studies that show that the vast majority of Muslims in the U.S. are being taught patriotism and loyalty to the U.S. Constitution.
How do you account for the union of the far left and the pro-Islamic rights? I mean, everything now is about rights, right? Everything's rights talk. You'd think that feminists of the 60s and 70s variety would be in lockstep with everything you're saying in light of how women are treated in Muslim countries and the specific prescriptions and proscriptions in the Qur'an and the Hadith with respect to how women ought to be treated. It's another strange disconnect.
Yeah, you're quite right. And actually, this book is all about strange disconnects. And I've got a chapter on how the feminist movement is completely indifferent to the suffering of women that is prescribed by and carried out in accord with Islamic law. And the feminists not only are turning a blind eye to the oppression of women in Islam, but are actually sanctioning it and glorifying it by making Linda Sarsour one of their heroes. And in the book, I detail how Linda Sarsour, who is a hijab-wearing, Sharia-observant Muslim, is one of the leaders of the women's movement today. She was one of the organizers of the Women's March on Washington in January 2017, right after President Trump was inaugurated. And she is somebody who has on numerous occasions spoken about how Sharia was really a fine thing. Now, Sharia mandates that a woman who that from whom a man fears disobedience can be beaten. And Sharia says that a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man. Both of those are based on the Qur'an, chapter 4, verse 34, and chapter 2, verse 282. She values a woman's inheritance rights. She gets less than her brothers do in inheritance. It says that a man can have up to 4 wives, as well as sex slaves who are non-Muslim women who've been captured in battle. The Quran says this, and that's in chapter 4, verse 3, 424, 23, 1-6, 33, 50, and 70, 30. I give the citations in case people want to check up on me. The captives of the right hand are the spoils of war, and they are non-Muslim women who are enslaved. Now, these kinds of things are frankly and obviously misogynist, but we have seen that there's a hierarchy of values on the left, and that for feminists, Islam, for some reason, trumps what they would otherwise declare to be their primary concerns. And their concern for women's rights goes out the window. In the book, I detail just how damaging that is, how dangerous that is, and how they are consigning untold numbers of women to lives of terrible suffering as a result.
I was stunned to see the tweet that you published in your book that Linda Sarsour said about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, about wanting to take away her vagina, in light of the fact that that Ms. Ali has undergone the genital mutilation procedure as a little girl. I find it hard. Do you think that Linda Sarsour could not have known that?
I don't know if she knew it or not, actually. It's possible, I think, that she didn't. If she doesn't keep up with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and only knows what her colleagues and allies say about her. But nonetheless, the fact remains that this is something that's sanctioned by Muhammad. It's something that he says is an honor for women. It is taught as being obligatory or at least acceptable by all the schools of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence. And are 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide. Linda Sarsour has to know that kind of thing. So for her to engage in that kind of language is extraordinarily reckless.
For people who are wondering what we're talking about, let's go to the uncomfortable truth of what genital mutilation is. It's the forcible removal of the clitoris and, I guess, surrounding tissues to, in a sense, neutralize the woman's sexual pleasure later in life. Is that a fair summary?
Later in life, at any point in life. And there are varying degrees to which it's done in terms of how much is cut, how much is taken of the surrounding tissue. The thing about it is, though, that it's done explicitly for that in order to make women less sexually responsive and more controllable. It is part of an overall anti-life, anti-joy, anti-everything that is good strain that is within Islam, that, the Islamic jihadis say we love death more than you love life, and therefore we will prevail. When I think, well, I would expect that the lovers of life actually have a good shot over the lovers of death, right, because God is life and love and so on. And these things being the case, I doubt that. But in any case, I digress. What I'm saying is that it's part of a frankly inhuman set of assumptions that is against what the real God has made in the world to make the world good. And so you have this being an accepted practice and practiced by tremendous numbers of people in the Islamic world. Over 90% of the women in Egypt have undergone this procedure, as well as significant percentages elsewhere. It's often been said that, this is just something that happens in North Africa. And then it came out that, there are quite a few Muslims in India and elsewhere, Indonesia, Iran, where this has happened also. And there's a trial right now of 2 Muslim doctors in Detroit who are on trial for performing female genital mutilation on little girls in the Detroit area. And they are from the Dawoodi Bohra sect, which is in India. So it's a virtually universal practice among Muslims. It's not that's not to say that it is practiced on every girl or every woman, but that it is found pretty much everywhere where there are Muslims. It's an extraordinarily extensive practice because it's justified by Muhammad's statements. You
mentioned God and the real God, and for listeners, no, I'm Catholic. You and I are both practicing Catholics. So I want to angle toward Catholic teaching as it's showcased in the Second Vatican Council documents and the Catechism and some of the things that Pope Francis has said. But I want to get there by a statement that George W. Bush made shortly after 9/11 that Islam is a religion of peace. Was that a tidal shift for you, a kind of a tectonic plate moving statement that made your work an awful lot harder?
Yes, certainly. That was the first time that the U.S. government had decided to enter into the realm of theology. And I don't know why George W. Bush thought it necessary to do. I think he could have and should have pursued the war on terror in a much more effective way by not making any statements whatsoever about the nature of Islam. It wasn't his place to do so. He's not the theologian in chief. And it was very counterproductive because it discouraged honest analysis of the motivating ideology behind the 9/11 attacks and all of the jihad terror attacks. And that being the case, it caused a lot more harm than it solved anything. People have said, well, you see, he had to say that because it would have alienated our Muslim allies, like Saudi Arabia. And I think, well, Saudi Arabia is responsible for a great deal of the jihad around the world today by spreading the Wahhabi ideology, which is a very virulent and violent form of Islam around the world.
And the 9/11 terrorists were not from Hoboken.
Yeah, they were 15 of the 19 were Saudis. So they knew what was going on. They knew that they know that it's not a religion of peace. It doesn't gain their support to lie about it. I can't see how not telling the truth about that or anything else ever gets you really anywhere. It might be prudent sometimes to remain silent, but not just to lie like that. And of course, Obama then made it the official U.S. government policy that Islam is a religion of peace and has nothing to do with terrorism, and swept out anybody and everybody, including me. I was not in the FBI as an agent, but I was a regular trainer of FBI agents, military groups, Joint Terrorism Task Force, and other government agencies, teaching them about the motives and goals, the worldview, the perspective of the jihadis. But Obama stopped all that because he wants to pretend that Islamic terrorism has nothing to do with Islam.
There's a kind of baptized version of this sentiment that crept into the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, that Islam is a religion of peace,
yes,
and that terrorist acts are a perversion of essentially good messaging in the holy foundational texts of Islam. There's nothing in it for Pope Francis or for anyone to say this in light of what just, as we go to air here, Robert, as you know, ISIS has released photos of a decapitated Pope Francis, promising Christmas of blood and so on. So in a way, the statements that sound irenic and notably Christian, in the sense of wanting to find common ground and wanting to be peaceful, backfire because they get perceived as expressions of weakness. Am I playing the card right here?
Yeah, you're quite right. This is the big flaw, the fatal flaw of the whole idea of dialogue, Muslim-Christian dialogue, that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and Pope Francis are so indefatigably committed to. What its essential effect is that it renders the Christian side unable or unwilling, because they don't want to offend their Muslim dialogue partners, to speak honestly about the nature of the Islamic Jihad and about the Islamic Jihad against Christians in the Middle East that has victimized and killed so many people and destroyed ancient Christian communities that went back to the time of Christ. Mm-hmm. They don't want to talk about that. And so the Christians and non-Christians who might be interested in the West are less informed than they might be about these issues. And people remain complacent about the jihad threat, which only enables the jihadis. Now, I'll give you a concrete example of how this works. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and particular bishops in the U.S. Do not like my work at all because I speak honestly about these issues. So a few years back, I was scheduled to speak at a Catholic men's conference, in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the Bishop Robert McManus canceled my appearance under pressure from Muslim Brotherhood organizations. And he explained that the talk that I was going to give about Muslim persecution of Christians in the Middle East would harm the dialogue that he was having in the Boston area with Muslim groups. Now, what's ironic about this is that his dialogue wasn't able to prevent the Boston Marathon bombing, which came out of the mosque that he was having dialogue with, the Islamic Society of Boston. And not only that, but the idea that we have to clam up about persecution, about negative aspects of Muslim-Christian interaction, if that's what we have to do for the dialogue, then what good is the dialogue? What's the point if we're just going to sit around and eat chicken and pita and hummus and pat each other on the back? That doesn't save a single Christian from being murdered by an Islamic jihadi or a single church from being burned.
I've wondered what the fruits are at all of 50 years of dialogue with non-Christians. Yeah.
Fruits are very bitter because the situation for Christians has deteriorated markedly in the Middle East. And the Middle East was 15% Christian in 1948, and now it's 3% Christian. Or less. Why is that? It's not because of Israel, it's because of Islamic Jihad. As a matter of fact, the only country in the Middle East where the Christian population has grown since 1948 is Israel. And elsewhere, they have been ferociously persecuted or subjected to ongoing low-level and sometimes high-level harassment, discrimination, intimidation, and persecution, as in Egypt. And so these are populations that, while they are suffering, their brethren and co-religionists in the West have been silent because they don't want to offend their dialogue partners. That in itself should be enough to shut down this dialogue. And I think the worst example is when Pope Benedict XVI criticized a massacre of Christians in a church in Alexandria in, I believe it was 2013. And Ahmed al-Tayeb, the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar in Cairo, the great institute of Islamic education, he castigated the Pope for interfering in Egypt's internal affairs and threatened that if the Pope didn't retract and apologize, for criticizing a massacre, remember, then he would break off the dialogue between Al-Azhar and the Vatican. And Pope Benedict did not apologize, did not make any further statement, and so al-Tayeb actually did break off the dialogue. Mm-hmm. Now, the condition of resuming the dialogue was that the Pope, according to the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, would have to promise not to say anything negative about Islam. And Pope Francis readily agreed to that condition and reestablished the dialogue, and has said in the apostolic exhortation the absolutely false statement that authentic Islam and the proper understanding of the Qur'an reject every form of violence. And he has said nothing, in particular, nothing strong about the Muslim persecution of Christians in the Middle East. He's certainly never named why they are persecuted. And all this is going on because he wants to pursue this dialogue, which only has enabled the further victimization of Christians.
Let's turn to the Catechism now. William Kilpatrick has said that there's more information on the side of an extra-strength Tylenol than there is in the modern teaching of the Catholic Church about that. So in Nostra Aetate, and this is 841 in the Catechism. Normally I don't like to read, but this is very, very short. The Church's relationship with the Muslims. Quote, the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place amongst whom are the Muslims. These profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. There's an ambiguity built in there that has not been defined yet. I know Cardinal Burke has said that Allah is not God the Father of Jesus Christ. And if he's not, then does that mean that Allah is a demon or a false God, or is it an imperfect understanding of God? Different Catholic apologists have different takes on this. What's yours?
I'll tell you something, Patrick. This is the cause of so much confusion in the church today. And part of it has to do with people not understanding the dogmatic value of Vatican II and the fact that it did not intend to define any doctrine, but only to elucidate matters for the modern world. That point has been lost. Also lost is a great deal of, well, I think that there's a studied ambiguity to a great deal of it, and that's in this case as well. When you read profess to adore the God of Abraham, mm-hmm. and I don't have it memorized, but it's something of the profess is there. And then together with us adore the one merciful God. Okay, do they profess to adore, do they profess to hold to the faith of Abraham and to adore the one God? Or
right.
Do they profess to hold the faith of Abraham, but they really do adore the one God? Many people insist that they really do adore the same God. Many Catholics will say, even in the face of statements about Muslim persecution of Christians and statements about Islamic theology and how it is so radically anti-Christian in the Qur'an and Muhammad, they will say, well, you know, the church says that we worship the same God, as if that precludes any further discussion or criticism of Islamic theology or actions, or jihad terror even included in that. Now, that's sort of a ridiculous take on it, I would say, because obviously the church says that many groups adore the one God, but would not say that doesn't mean you can't preach the gospel to them or shouldn't, or that you should never speak out about the differences that we have.
Yeah.
But this passage has given rise to a very widespread assumption that it is church teaching that Islam is a religion of peace, that of course, the Pope Francis, in particular, has reinforced this. That there was even a Monsignor in Kansas who I was in a debate with, and he told me, "You're a dissenter because you don't believe that Islam is a religion of peace and that we worship the same God." The fact is that if you look, quite aside from Nostra Aetate and the Catechism, if you look at the teachings of the Qur'an, you see a God where the Trinity is explicitly and repeatedly rejected, and where Jesus' divinity is explicitly and repeatedly rejected, and those who believe that Jesus is divine are called unbelievers. And where in chapter 91, verse 7 of the Qur'an, it says that Allah puts both good and evil in the heart of man, which is very, very different from the biblical idea that God is good and that evil is the rejection of God, not something that God makes you do. And there is the idea in the Quran that Allah will fill hell with human beings, that he could have guided all men to this truth, but instead he will fill hell with jinns, who are spirit beings, and men, which is directly opposed to the Christian idea that God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So to say that these are the same God is an uninformed opinion at best. Now, where the Catechism and the Nostra Aetate come down on that is a matter, as you have noted, of vastly different opinions among Catholic theologians. Certainly the Church has become extraordinarily inhospitable for those who don't believe that Islam is a religion of peace and that we don't believe in the same God. But the truth is still the truth to anyone who wants to find it.
Robert, do you believe that there's any form of macro-level reformation possible within the Islamic world?
Yeah.
Sunni or Shia?
We saw it in the 18th century. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was a reformer who wanted to sweep away all innovation, bid'ah, and get back to just what the Quran and Muhammad taught. And so he came up with what is known as Wahhabism, which is a more violent and more virulent and more intransigent form of Islam than the others that existed previously. That's reform. If you take Martin Luther, now this is not to say that he actually did it, but what he professed to be doing, there's that word again, professed, what he said he was doing was he was going to get back to the basics and strip away all the later accretions and get back to what Jesus himself taught, and that would be his Reformation.
Yeah.
Now, that's what Wahhab intended to do.
In the sense of get back to the original source material and get rid of, strip off the barnacles from the boat, as it were.
Right. Now, once again, I'm not meaning to get into a discussion of Lutheranism or defending Luther. I'm only saying that's what he said he was going to do, and that's just what Wahhab said he was going to do. What we would need in order to make Islam not violent is a reformation of a totally different kind that would actually reject the literal understanding of the texts and would develop some sort of a spiritualization of the Quranic text in particular that would defang all of its calls to violence.
What do you say to Muslim apologists with whom you've debated when they say that later texts in the Quran domesticate and sort of contextualize the earlier exhortations to violence?
Well, actually, that's exactly backwards from the way that Islamic theology has traditionally proceeded. In Islam, the Quran says in chapter 2, verse 106, whatever we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we will give you a passage that is just as good or better. So he's saying, I mean, that's the way out of a self-proclaimed prophet who's contradicting himself. He's saying, if we cancel something out, we'll give you something better, so don't worry. And so when in the Quran, a passage that is considered to have been revealed chronologically later contradicts one that came earlier, it is the general understanding of Islamic scholars that the one that comes later supersedes and has precedence over the one that came earlier. Unfortunately for us as non-believers, the later passages contain more violence and calls to warfare against unbelievers than the earlier passages. So when Islamic apologists tell me that it's the other way around, I know they're not being honest, and I can invoke Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Qayyim, Muhammad ibn Abdul Humaid, the former Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia, many other authorities throughout Islamic history who say that the later violent passages take precedence over the earlier, more peaceful ones. Mahmoud Muhammad Taha was a Sudanese theologian who was executed for heresy in 1985 for teaching that the peaceful passages should have preference over the tolerant ones, over the violent ones.
One thing I've noticed about the jihadi activities is their attachment to liminal moments and anniversaries. Maybe you discuss September 11th, 1683 in your book. People have no idea what that is. What's the compressed version of September 11th, 1683?
That was the breaking of the siege of Vienna. The Ottomans, the jihadis of the Ottoman Empire, had been besieging Vienna, and the siege was broken by the Polish king Jan Sobieski and his troops and others at Vienna on September 11, 1683. So when the jihadis struck the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington on September 11, 2001, it seems to me that it was a tacit announcement that they were back now and we're going to pick up where they left off.
A lot of apologizing going on in countries like my home and native land of Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau seems very concerned to apologizing for Islamophobia and wanting an almost non-filtered immigration policy to hold sway in Canada.
Yes, that's right, Patrick. Obviously, the Canadian government has now gotten this M103 motion against Islamophobia. Now, it's very interesting because, in the first place, Islamophobia is not defined in the.
That you've just taken my next question. How's that defined?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And in the book, Confessions of an Islamophobe, I explain that there are two different kinds of Islamophobia. There are vigilante attacks on innocent Muslims, which are never justified anywhere under any circumstances. And then there's also the honest analysis of jihadi activity and the motives and goals of the jihadis, which is what I do, which is also called Islamophobia, in an attempt to lump the two together and smear an honest analysis of jihadi activity and motives by conflating it with the vigilante activity. This is the danger of the Canadian motion, that it will inhibit, and it's already inhibiting, freedom of speech about the nature and magnitude of the jihad threat, under the guise that this somehow endangers Muslims. And recently I spoke at Stanford University, or tried to speak, but the administration and leftists and Muslim students colluded to make sure that I spoke to as small an audience as possible. They packed the hall and then walked out after 5 minutes and wouldn't let anybody else in who wanted to be there. But the point was that they were able to get this across and get the administration on board to do this by claiming that I was Islamophobic and that my presence and discussion would actually endanger Muslim students. Now, nobody's actually ever been hurt in the context of my speaking, except me, when I was poisoned in Iceland.
I was going to say, how many Muslims or their apologists have you poisoned by slipping a drug in their drink?
There you go. So it's ridiculous on its face, but nonetheless, this claiming of victimhood status, claiming of being endangered, is simply yet more of a tactic to intimidate people into fearing to discuss this. And now it's essentially official government policy in Canada.
In your book, Confessions of an Islamophobe, I don't see any evidence that like-minded Muslims who think as you do have come alongside you and kind of yoked themselves to what you're trying to do. Have you had any allies from the Muslim world trying to throw attention at least at what you're doing and say, look, this guy's making sense and we have to look in the mirror?
I did, yes. I did for several years. The Pakistani Muslim reformer, Tashbi Syed, was my great friend, and he was a board member of my organization, Jihad Watch, until his untimely death in 2007. He was the only Muslim who ever said what needed to be said, as far as I know, which is that Islam needs to be reformed, and in order to reform it, there needs to be a searching and honest reevaluation of the nature of Muhammad as the excellent and supreme example for Muslims, and the Qur'an as the perfect book. Obviously, those two things are tremendous obstacles to reform, because if Muhammad is the excellent example, and he was a warlord, then what's the problem with waging jihad and going to war against unbelievers like Muhammad did? And if the Quran is perfect, and the Quran says, "This day I have perfected your religion for you," chapter 5, verse 3, then how are you going to fix it? You don't reform what's perfect.
You said untimely. May I ask how he died?
Well, he was in his 60s, and so I think that's nowadays a bit young to die. And he was ill from actually. I don't actually recall now how what it was. He wasn't killed. He wasn't murdered or killed in an accident. He died of natural causes, something that he was afflicted with.
Sure. Should people listening be more vigilant when holidays or seasons like Ramadan roll around?
Yes.
I'm willing to bet that during Christmas week and Easter week, crime goes down in any major city. It's just anecdotal evidence. I think there's a natural with Christmas carols and lights and so on. I know Michael Medved and Dennis Prager have said, they love Christmas because people are really, really sweet in public. What about Ramadan?
Ramadan is the month of jihad, Patrick, and it's the time when Muslims are supposed to redouble their efforts to be pleasing to Allah. And so they pray more, they fast during the day, and they engage in various religious devotions. Now, it has to be borne in mind that jihad is a religious devotion, that if the Quran is commanding people to wage war against unbelievers, then that's the command of Allah. That's something that would be pleasing to Allah if you do. And so there's more of it during Ramadan, and several thousand people killed around the world, generally as a rule, during every Ramadan, than we see elsewhere at other times of the year.
But isn't jihad just like working out at the gym and eating well and striving for self-transformation?
Yes.
Tongue is in cheek here.
No, you're right in a certain sense, Patrick. I have on the shelf behind me, I have a manual of Islamic law that is certified by Al-Azhar, that great institution of Sunni Islam, as being conforming rather to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. So in other words, it's sort of like the catechism. You want to know what Islam is all about, Sunni Islam, you can go to this book. And it says that there's the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And the greater jihad is the spiritual struggle within one's soul to conform one's life to the will of Allah. And that's about all it says about the greater jihad. And then it goes on about the lesser jihad, which it says, quite frankly, is warfare against non-Muslims, for about 10 pages, detailing how the war should be conducted, the spoils of war, how the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians, need to be subjugated under the rule of the Muslims, what happens if they break the agreement, and so on.
This may sound like a really dumb question, and we're just closing our time together, Robert. Why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep focusing on Islam and jihadism? It gets you canceled speaking engagements, threats to your ability to make a living, and people slip bad things in your beverages. So why do you keep doing it and writing it and saying it?
Patrick, I know I'm telling the truth, and I know that what I'm saying is accurate, and so how could I possibly stop? You remember the old Aesop's fable about the sun and the north wind, and they have an argument about which one's going to get the guy to take off his coat? And
yes, I do.
The north wind blows and blows and blows hard, and the guy just clutches his coat more firmly around him, and then the sun comes out and makes everything warm, and the guy feels all happy and takes his coat off. Well, the north wind is blowing all around me, and as long as it blows more fiercely and fiercely around me, I'm going to keep clutching this coat.
That's a nice place to put in at least an ellipses or a semicolon. Robert Spencer, I always learn a ton when we speak. Thanks for joining us today and for writing Confessions of an Islamophobe. And people can get the book at patrickcoffin.media and some additional show notes and other resources. And you'll find out the two senses in which one can be an Islamophobe. Robert Spencer, thank you so much.
Pleasure, Patrick. Thank you.
This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?